who has been in solitary confinement, the deepest solitary confinement that they have in the federal system. And he's been there, I think it's 36 years now. 36 years. There's a guy who just got out of Louisiana solitary confinement after 40 years of solitary confinement. Some of it's unbelievable. Now, Silverstein, since he's been in prison, he has killed 3 people. He killed 2 COs and he killed a fellow inmate, brutally. He's a brutal guy. So, you know, here's a guy. You have to have some way to deal with the Silverstein. You cannot just say, well, he should be in more humane condition. You have to deal with the Silverstein. I don't think he'll do it again. I know his lawyer. He just lost in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, trying to get some more art supplies after 35 years. I mean, well, he's 70 years old now. So you have to have a response that protects inmates and staff from a Silverstein, no question about it. But the problem is when you design a system around your deep end problem case, you've just swept everybody into it, and there's so many people who don't need to be in solitary confinement. That's the main problem. There's a guy in Nebraska. I'm blanking on his name right now, but I followed his case closely, not more from the literature. Nico Jenkins. Nico Jenkins was in the Nebraska system, and under the Nebraska sentencing, they have a mandated form of good time so that when your good time eats into your maximum, you must be discharged. Nico Jenkins told them 3 weeks, he's in solitary confinement for years, deservedly, because he's a dangerous guy. He said, if you let me out, I will kill. He said, don't let me out. And they discharged him. He didn't even have parole. In 3 weeks, 3 weeks out, he killed 3 people. And to discharge a floridly psychotic person like that and not civilly commit him, for example, into the public is an incredibly stupid, dangerous act on the part of the authorities. There had to be a way to deal with that. But these are the deep end, these are the dramatic cases. We did a study in Ohio at their request on who's in solitary and why. How many people are in there and why? They didn't know. How many? So we had to count them up. And why are they in solitary confinement? And we found that 1/3 of the inmates were locked down, sometimes for 6 months, a year, 2 years. It was a term that said refuse to lock. I didn't know what that meant. Inmate refused to lock. 1/3 of them. What did that mean? It meant that the prison officials, for whatever reason, wanted them to move from one cell to another or to another cell block, and they had their own reasons, good, bad, and they didn't want to move. So that's not a good thing as far as running a prison goes. But do you lock a guy down, and for extended periods for refusal to lock? Some of them were in there for discipline. And some of them were in there for what we call administrative segregation. So when I start to talk about just this concept of solitary confinement or restrictive housing, one of the difficulties, it not only goes by so many different names, it's used for a lot of different reasons. People are locked. People are put into a form of isolation for medical reasons. They have contagious disease. People are put into a form of solitary confinement in intensive care after a medical procedure. People are put into this sort of confinement. It's called PC, protective custody. They're going to get hurt. Did you remember reading about that Ohio case? Raul Castro, the bus driver, who kidnapped these 3 women and kept them in his basement. He committed suicide in the first month that he got to prison, and he was in a form of protective custody, but the question was, they knew that they were going to get sued. So I was retained along with somebody else, and we studied that case and gave a report to the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, basically saying they made a lot of mistakes, but they weren't deliberately indifferent. But here's a guy who had to be protected from other inmates, himself maybe. He didn't look suicidal. The man had never had a traffic ticket. He didn't look so, and the staff were harassing him terribly, and he was, I'm not saying they drove him to it, I don't know, but he found some very interesting ways. So you have people who have a disease, contagious. You have people who need protection. But the two main categories that concern me are what's called disciplinary confinement and ADSEG. And the worst of the two is ADSEG. I'll try to explain. You're sent to prison for punishment, but when you're in the prison system, there's a disciplinary code that is a kind of an internal criminal code, and there's a procedure, wolf hearings are so-called held, and you are given a hearing before a tribunal, sometimes 3 officers, sometimes 1, and you can be given a term of restrictive housing or solitary confinement. Typically, there's some kind of a proportionality principle at stake, not always. Sometimes you can do a long time in solitary for disciplinary that's unrelated to the seriousness of the offense. But the most pernicious form, and the one that is the most deviling to me, of segregation, and I realize I haven't described all those conditions yet, but I will in a minute, is what we call administrative segregation. You have no right to due process. It is not based on what you've done. It's based on who they say you are. Findings of dangerousness. So it may be stipulated by an infraction, but it doesn't have to be. And that's the one where there's no due process, there's no end to it. It's a lifetime sentence, if need be. Sometimes there's due process reviews that are built into it, but you can be kept forever in a form of solitude, you might say. And that's the one that I think we read about these inmates who are doing these long stretches, these 30, 40, 20 years. You can't believe how they do it. They're doing ADSEG time, as it's called. Now, what can be done about that? And sometimes in the law, my colleagues, you have a substantive problem and you try to solve it with a procedural solution. It never works. It never works. If what I'm talking about, let's say with ADSEG, is torture, again, I have to get, there's no way to fairly do torture. Fair procedures don't equate with, and now you can torture the guy. So if putting a guy into long-term ADSEG violates the Constitution, as I think it does, the 8th Amendment, then there's no way to solve that by a fair procedure. I don't know if you can follow that, but you can. In one of the issues of newsletter that I do, I got a bunch of experts together, and I asked them to comment on a proposal that I just dreamed up one day. It was after reading a colleague's article about Kafka, and I made up a state, a hypothetical state, and they decided that there's too much violence in this particular prison system, and the new proposal was that whoever commits a serious assault on a correctional officer, whatever prison, would be subject to the amputation of one of his arms. And if it was a particularly serious offense, it would be the arm you most favored, but in the mercy of the tribunal, they could do the off arm if harm wasn't so great. And I said, he's going to have a right to counsel, due process, grand jury if you want, discovery proceedings, before you take the arm off. I don't know if you see where I'm going with that. So you give all the procedure in the world, but if you think that you can't constitutionally remove an arm, no matter how serious the offense or how much procedure, then you can't do it. So if you accept certain forms of segregation, I keep using the solitary confinement, as torture, you cannot fairly impose torture. You can't do it. The amputation of the arm, it just makes it so easy. You can get, but so what is it about? What is it about being in solitary confinement, which often isn't solitary, that causes so much distress? Okay, legally, there's two ways to come at it, and under the Eighth Amendment as well. There's two approaches. One approach will be more comfortable, I would think, for those of you who are students at the School of Criminal Justice here. One's an empirical approach. How much harm does it cause? How much harm does it cause? How long does it last? How deep is the harm? And the other is a human rights approach, that no matter how equivocal the evidence on harm, the idea of long-term solitary confinement violates concepts of human dignity, of human autonomy, which are at the core of the Eighth Amendment. Now, that doesn't mean that they are mutually exclusive. You can, when I'm helping do a case in a court as a witness or whatever, as writing a brief, I'll use both approaches. I mean, because if they say the evidence is weak, then you say every international tribunal, the United Nations, the new Mandela rules they're called, condemns extended penal confinement. So that it violates after Mandela, when himself went through such a long term. So we have, to repeat the point, to attack it under the Eighth Amendment and to show that it's cruel and unusual punishment. I'm talking a hell of a lot longer than I thought I was going to. Sorry. Well, you look interested. I'll keep going. I took myself. But so you have the philosophical human rights approach, which is, but you heard what I was doing with the Jesuit Foundation, which is trying to talk these private. Wasn't my plan. They